Hey guys, this is Phil Galfond for BlueFirePoker.com, and today I'm going to be reviewing my first round matchup in the 25K Heads Up PLO Championship on FullTiltPoker.net. I played against Peter Jespin, whose name is under here. I started the recording during the middle of the first hand, but I wanted to talk real quickly just about my PLO videos in general, kind of my approach to the game, or rather my approach to teaching it. Most of my videos, at least for the first 6 months at Blue Fire Poker, are going to be targeted towards beginning to intermediate players. And I like to consider them kind of advanced beginner videos because I think that most beginner videos are taught by beginners or taught by advanced players that don't really know how to teach. And I think that a lot of beginning players start off with the wrong kind of fundamentals. Maybe they get the right kind of idea about what hands to play pre-flop, but then they don't really know what they should be thinking about, which is our main focus at Blue Fire Poker, is to teach you to think about the game, not just how to play specific spots, because there's so many unique spots that'll come up in poker that if you can't think on your own, we can't make enough videos to show you every spot. So, in a lot of my, beginner advanced videos, I'll just be talking about what you should be thinking about in certain spots and general fundamentals of the game. And we'll get into some advanced concepts, but advanced concepts that you can understand if you haven't played much PLO before, or if you've played some, but it's not your main game. That said, since this is a large buy-in heads-up tournament that a lot of people watch, I think that I'm going to make this targeted more towards intermediate to advanced players. So I'm going to kind of ignore some things that would be obvious to intermediate players, but not so obvious to beginners. And I'm kind of going to be talking with the audience of pretty good PLO players in mind. So if you are a beginning PLO player, do I think you can learn something from this video? Yes, probably. But do I think it's going to be the best video for you to watch on our site or on the internet? Certainly not. I think that a lot of my other videos that I'll be coming out with, or already have come out with for PLO, would be a lot better suited for you. So, if you still want to watch for entertainment value of a high-stakes match, by all means, enjoy it. We start off pretty deep stacks. I believe the blinds are 15-30, so we're 200 big blinds deep. My approach in heads-up tournaments is that I like to do everything I can to lower variance. And, in general I want to lower variance, but it's that much more important in these heads-up tournaments for a couple reasons. One, I feel that I'm a lot stronger than the field in the heads-up tournaments. They draw a lot of weaker players, people that wouldn't play at the stakes I normally play. And the other reason is just that I can't rebuy. So what I want to do is maximize my post-flop edge against these people that I think I have a big edge on, and especially in PLO, you can get into 3-betting and 4-betting battles, and, check-raising, 3-betting flop battles where you're both just getting it in 55-45. And I don't think that it's a bad way to play, especially in a cash game. But in a tournament, I think it's going to reduce my edge. I don't want to get all in right now on a 55-45 because I think my edge is bigger than 55% against most of the people that I'll be facing this tournament. So with that in mind, I like to limp a lot of buttons. I like to restrain myself from 3-betting much, and I'll also be checking back in a lot of spots where in a cash game I would bet. I'll also be check calling in a lot of spots where I might check raise in a cash game. Things like that. You don't want to become so tight passive that it gets to the point where you don't have an edge anymore. But I think there are a lot of spots where you're not giving up much by just decreasing variance. So with that in mind, I actually open limp this first hand. 9-9 deuce 3 is not a great hand, but it's certainly playable. And he potted, which I feel like he's going to do why. I didn't really know yet, and I decided to call. Now, the flop is fairly good for our hand. It's got to scare a lot of the hands he has, assuming, he might be more likely to raise some high card hands than some low suited connectors, which he would also raise, but he wouldn't be raising like low offsuit connectors so much. So anyways, I guess start the video. And I go ahead and call the flop. I think that, you can raise. I don't think you can ever fold this flop. You have a flush draw and a gutter, and, the nines count for something, just, first of all, because they're a pair, second of all, because if an 8 or 10 rolls off, you have blockers that you can bluff with. The turn is a deuce, and this is a spot where I think a lot of people misplay their hand. Sorry about that, I paused the wrong video, so I hope the audio didn't skip too much. I meant to pause the playback, but I paused the recording. Anyways, what I was saying was that I think that this is a spot where a lot of people misplay their hand. They think, especially no-limit players, they think, okay, well, I have some showdown value, I have a lot of outs, I don't want to get check raised off my hand, I'll check it back. This is a spot where, especially because of stack sizes, and just the board texture, he's never checking the turn to check raise, or almost never. Just people don't do that. It puts him in such a bad spot, pretty much with any hand. So I think that he's going to be check folding a lot and check calling a lot. I certainly have enough equity to make kind of a semi-bluff. I might have the best hand, so you consider it a protection bet, but I don't have a hand good enough that, I'm looking to put more money in on the river, things like that, in most cases, unimproved. So this is purely a semi-bluff that I think will take down the pot a lot, and I'll have decent equity when called, and I just don't think I'm going to be check raised much at all. And he folds pretty quickly. And he raised the button. King, Queen, 8-6, suited to the king. It's a decent hand. It's not great. But in heads-up play, hand values change quite a bit. I didn't really get a feel for how light he's opening, obviously, because it was the second hand. But I have played with Peter before, but I don't know how he plays heads-up. I don't think I've ever played him heads-up PLO. Queen 10-9-9 double suited is a great hand. This is a hand I might 3-bet in other circumstances, but like I said, I want to be avoiding variance here, so it's a pretty no-brainer call. And I flop a flush draw and decide to check. I think the leading here is okay, but especially wanting kind of lower variance, I think that checking is pretty much just as good of an option. Once he bets, I can raise, I can call, I can't fold. I think the best play is to call, just because I can represent a lot of things. For instance, I can represent an ace, so I do decide to go ahead and lead this turn. I think that Peter's good enough to know that I will be check calling with ace-deuce, ace-8, and also just other aces. You might ask why I'm turning a pair of nines into a bluff, but I don't really consider it. I mean, I do consider it a bluff, but my hand's not really strong enough where I want to be check calling, and check raising is an expensive bluff, but I kind of have too much value to check fold, so I think a better option is to lead. And I think one way, especially in PLO, this comes up more, but one way to find the best option is to compare it to all the others. And so I think that leading with this hand just makes the most sense because I rarely get raised, and I have some decent equity, but not quite enough that I want to be check calling. So I go ahead and lead. I think that I represent a hand okay. The 10 is not a really good card from my hand. If I did have an ace-8 or ace-deuce, which I was kind of trying to rep, I missed. He also, given the board texture, he's calling with either, queens with a flush draw or an ace, basically. Possibly an underboat. Or maybe even ace-8 or ace-deuce to get tricky, or to pot control with ace-deuce, something like that. But because of that, I think that even though I think I represent a strong hand fairly well, I think he's going to have too strong a range for me to bluff him off it, and even kings could find a call on this board. So he did have a bad ace. The ace is bad because his jacks, he had a pair of jacks, so it gives him less outs against a made boat. And, he, had I checked the turn, maybe had to fold. That I didn't really lose much more than I would have had I check folded, even knowing his hand. Just because I had plenty of equity when I made the bet, and also, he could be second barreling there with a lot of weak draws, even just air, and then I'd probably have to check fold if I checked. So I'm very happy with the way I played that. I do remember him being pretty aggressive early in the match. I was trying to keep the pace slow, but he was raising my limps. He was raising a lot of buttons, which kind of foiled my plan a little bit. But I still was working hard to keep pots small. So it's 8-9-4-3 is a pretty junky hand. The thing about PLO is that you're never super far behind. If somebody's folding a lot in the big blind heads up, you really can't be making a mistake by raising any hand. But, most people like to play a lot of hands in PLO, so it is, you're not going to steal the blinds as often as you might think, or as often as you can in No Limit. So here, this is a hand I usually would raise. If I'm trying to lower variance, I might limp call it, but I actually elected to limp re-raise here because I want to be able to limp in the future and not get raised. So I wanted to show him that I'm willing to limp re-raise so that he will slow down on his raising my limps. And, it's also a very good hand. So, in a cash game, had I limped, I would re-raise all day, just because it plays very well against a lot of hands. So on this flop, I have a couple options. I can bet or check. I didn't want to bet and get raised because I've played with Peter before, but not a whole lot, never heads up. I don't have a good feel for how often he'd check raise the flop. So I wouldn't have been really confident folding or really confident calling or 3-betting. And had I had total air, I'd be more likely to bet. Obviously, a strong hand, I would bet. But given that I had, basically a lot of outs, I didn't want to get blown off this hand, so I decided to check and proceed from there. Turns a 7 of spades, not a good card at all. When he bets 316 to 540, I'm certainly calling. Raising doesn't really represent much. It represents pocket sevens that limp re-raised, which basically doesn't happen. So I thought about it for a little bit, but realized that Peter's smart enough to realize that no hand makes sense for that. And that's not to say that he's going to 3-bet bluff me, but he's going to call with a lot of his hands that have any value. And I do have the 3 overcards and flush draw. And given the board texture, I actually do expect a lot of those to be good. Since the board's paired, he has a 4 sometimes, but when he doesn't, had this been 2, 3, 4, 7, or even something more disconnected like 2, Jack, 4, 7, it's so likely that he has 2 pair that my overcards aren't good. But since the 4s are paired, any of my pairs gives me 2 pairs. So if he doesn't have a 4 or a boat, I have a lot of equity. And there are rivers I can make moves on. I was actually thinking about making a small bet on a blank river just to represent an overpair, because I did limp pre-raise. And that is a play I'll make with an overpair. So the ace hits, I don't really see a reason to bet, and I check it down and win. He did have a pair and a flush draw, so he was ahead on the turn by a little bit, but I had his flush draw covered, so probably would have made a little bit if we both hit. Not a great hand here, but he's been raising most of the buttons so far. Fluff second up flush draw on top pair, which is a great hand. I thought about leading, but I elected to check. I felt that he was c-betting a lot, so I wanted to just let him. I turned the second nuts, and I don't think it's a great spot to check raise, because I just don't think he might bet, actually, but I felt like he was calling a lot after checking behind the flop, so I felt like there was a lot of value in a bet. Whereas I couldn't be so confident that he would bet, and I also felt that he's the type of player that when I lead there, he could make some kind of move, but he wouldn't make a move against a check raise. And I kind of want to balance against my bluffs, because I will want to bluff in that spot a whole lot. It's kind of an interesting spot. I limped with aces, weak aces, for the same reason I limped last time. I actually was not going to limp re-raise here, but I wanted to protect my limps, and even if this didn't get the showdown, something makes me feel good just about balancing my limping range and kind of knowing that I'm doing it. That doesn't really mean that it necessarily helps me, but it makes me tougher to play against. So he checks, and this is an interesting flop because I have the blocker to the nut flush, unless he has, 6-4 spades, then he has straight flush. But I also have a pair of aces, so I kind of have to decide, do I want to try to show down my aces, or do I want to bluff at this pot? And I decide to keep my options open by betting. And what this does is it gives me the option of 3-barrel if I get the feeling that he has a flush or has like a weak 2-pair or a set maybe. But it also protects my hand against, if he has king, queen, jack 7 with no spades, he has plenty of outs. So I'd rather just take down the pot right here. I do have a gut shot too. It doesn't matter a whole lot. The 3 hits, and since the nut flush is no longer the nuts, I can't use my ace as a blocker to represent the nuts. So had he checked, I actually would have checked back, figuring I'd be good a decent amount, and also just because I wouldn't feel comfortable 3-barreling, since the great thing about 3-barreling with the naked ace is that they can't have the nuts. But once the turn hits, he could have had 6-4, but once the turn hits, I don't know that he can't have the nuts. He could certainly have 7s or 5s or something like that. And I decided to fold. It's a little bit of a tight fold, but I just didn't see him turning a lot of hands into a bluff because I felt any hand he check called with there had some showdown value. Flushes of any size. Even the only hand really would be a 2-pair, like 5-7. But even a hand like jacks, I think he would just check down there. So I limp a pretty junky hand here, but I felt like he wasn't going to raise me as much anymore because of the time I limp re-raised. Had I expected him to raise a lot, I would throw this hand away pre-flop, or I'd raise if he wasn't a big 3-better. So I decided to check behind the flop for lowering variance reasons. I think that betting is fine. Once he checks the turn, I actually don't. I expect to be good, but at the same time, I expect him to be folding almost always. A lot of people, especially Peter, from what I know about him, would lead the turn there if he wanted to play the hand. So I think that although, I'm not taking him off a better hand very often, I'd just rather take it down there and not let him hit. So I limp again with a somewhat junky hand, and he checks, and I decide to pot this flop. And there's not a whole lot of reason to it. I kind of just wanted to put some pressure on him. I like to mix up my bet sizes with no real rhyme or reason. I have a lot of times where I will make a bet size for a specific reason, but this time it was just because, to make me harder to read. He calls and turns a king. I don't have many outs against any legitimate hand, but this is a really good card to 2-barrel on. Reason being, he has, a huge part of his range is Queen X, and he might have some hands like, naked flush draws, naked 4-5s, maybe like a 5-6-7 X, and all of those hands have kind of gotten hurt by this turn card. In No Limit, it's obviously a good turn card to bluff because it's a higher card to any of the cards on the board, and you can represent a king well. It's a little different than the PLO, but it's still a good card to represent because some of his hands, like Queen XXX, now have no outs against some of the hands I'm representing. If I have a hand like King 6 and he has Queen, Jack, 10-7, he now has 2 queens, and those are his only outs. So it's a good, and that's a huge part of his range. So it's a good card to barrel on. I certainly don't barrel every time I have no outs. If I have a flush draw here, or an open-ender, or anything that strong, I'm pretty much always 2-barreling this card, especially with stacks this deep in position. It's a complete junk hand. This is a pretty bad hand, too. I'm kind of surprised I folded. I probably would limp or raise that. That's another terrible hand. A lot of people overvalue a lot of hands in PLO. Not that I suspect anybody overvalues 7-6 deuce 3, but this isn't actually a very good hand. I think this is kind of a steal. I've been quiet, and I feel like he's going to give me a lot of respect, but he doesn't, and he goes ahead and 3-bets. I think he has a pretty good hand. He hasn't 3-bet me yet. There are a lot of hands that I would defend with this deep. Jack 10 5-3 just doesn't hit very many good flops. You have a Jack high flush draw. You've, a couple cards that are connected and in a couple different places. It's just pretty easy to throw it away, I think. Especially considering that I feel his range is pretty strong there. It is a very good hand, especially for heads up. I think I was going to limp re-raise again. I feel like he didn't. Oh, he raises. Maybe I don't, because I don't remember a second limp re-raise. Yeah, I guess I limp called, which is fine. I think I prefer to limp call in a vacuum, but I do want to be able to limp more, and so I kind of would like to limp re-raise just to keep him from raising my limps. But I'm fine with the way I played that too. This is kind of a junky double-suited hand, but having a suited ace makes it playable, especially with as many buttons as he's been opening. On a flop like this, it's kind of another one of those spots where, considering all my options, I'd rather lead than check call or check raise or check fold. And there are a lot of good turn cards, there are a lot of turn cards that hit me, and also a lot of turn cards that I can represent. Okay, so this is an interesting spot. Normally, if somebody's playing pretty straightforward, you have to throw this away. You just have an open-ender. When the 8 hits, it's not the nuts, so you basically are looking for a 3. I have backdoor diamonds, but, all that out of position to a fairly large raise is not that exciting, to say the least. I really felt like he was light here. I'm trying to think if I can describe it in words why I did. But basically, his raise is less than pot size, and I felt like he would make a pot size raise with a lot of his big hands. I also felt like he might call a lot of his draws, or strong draws. And it just felt like he wasn't respecting this lead. You might say, well, if he wasn't going to respect the lead, why lead in the first place? And you're right. I kind of just didn't expect him to raise many hands here at all, as far as for value. He can't really be raising a hand like 9-6 for value. I mean, he can, but he shouldn't be. So I put him on sets here, and then I also put him on hands like 10-9, 7-6, hands with gutters and top 2. And then I really do put him on air a decent amount of the time here. And so it's kind of a really weird spot because I can't raise and call off. That would be pretty bad. But I don't really like the idea of raise folding because I do have some equity, and I feel like I look very strong when I call this raise. Basically, when I call this raise, it means I have a pretty big wrap or 2-pair myself with a gutter. Basically, the strong hands that he's repping. So the 7 hits, and my thinking is, if he does have air, he might continue. So I can't really check call. I certainly can't check call, and I'm afraid about him bluffing again. I can also see him just raising a hand like Ace King 9-5, just because he didn't want to call it, so he'd rather raise. So I think I get him off hands like that, and I can just very credibly represent the nuts here. If he does have a set, I think that 2 barrels will very easily take him off it. Not the turn. I think he'll call the turn, but I think he'll fold the river just because nothing really missed for me. Any legitimate hand that I'm bet calling on this flop against a fairly large raise out of position is either 2-pair or made straight now. I don't think he'd expect me to peel this lightly. So I think and he wouldn't expect me to turn 2-pair into a bluff. So I believe that I could take him off a set by the river. So I go ahead and bet. A lot of people kind of use blockers as a way to decide how to bluff in PLO, and that's a good way. But I like to use situations more, and especially I like to use ranges, as far as ranges like cards that I can very credibly represent, and this is one of those. Even though, I don't have pocket tens here to make it less likely that he has the nuts, I just have played the hand in a way that I very well could have a big hand. 10 hits, and this is pretty interesting. The problem with this is that I was repping 10-8, so now I can't really make a large bet. If I make a large bet, I'm representing Jack-8, the nuts. I just wouldn't make a large bet with a lone 8. The other problem is he can very, very easily have an 8. He could have had 10-8 himself, though I think he would have raised the turn. But he could also have a hand like 8-5, which is actually loses to 8-7. But he could have 8-5-7, something like that. So I don't think I can bluff big here, just because he's going to have an 8 too often. But I think that if he was raising the flop with a legitimate hand, he either has a straight now, had a straight on the turn, but probably would have raised it, or has a 2-pair set, or maybe like 3-pair on the turn. And I think that if I bet something small, I could take him off the weaker of those hands. And I also think that he could have a hand like, I don't know, King, Jack 10 with clubs that he just raised on the flop because he wanted to, and then peeled the turn because he has a gutter and clubs. That's one hand, but I think there are a few that play similarly. So, given all that, I expect him to have something that can call me more than half the time. But if I make a small bet, I'm laying myself a really good price on the bluff. So, if I do make a bet, a little over a third of the pot, it doesn't have to work all that often for me to show a profit. And he should pretty much be certain that I have a straight here. Given the action, honestly, knowing me, if I was in his shoes, or if, just playing against anybody, any decent player, I would expect me or them to have a straight here between 90 and 95% of the time. So, and he's a competent enough player to be able to make a laydown if he does have like a 2-pair set. That's not really even a laydown in this spot. So I felt that if he didn't have a straight, he would have to fold here. So given the chance that he has a set, or that he had like a King, 10, Jack type hand like I was talking about, or 3-pair on the turn, or 2-pair, I think that this bet will make him fold enough of the time that I'm laying myself a good enough price. And he times out and folds. I don't think that was an accident, so that worked out. You see, I thought about raising and then remembered that I'm trying to keep a low variance and decided to limp. This flop is okay to check back, because there are a lot of pretty good turn cards for your hand, but I didn't feel he would check raise that often, especially after that big pot. I think he'd kind of be a little afraid to get involved in another big pot without the goods. So I just decided to c-bet. It's not a great hand. It's double suited, but, I'm not that excited about it. He raises, and it's certainly good enough to call a raise, getting 2-1 and in position. Position's so huge in PLO, so much more important than a no-limit. And this is an interesting flop. I have a pair of kings, but I basically have nothing. I'm more excited about my backdoor spades than my pair of kings. I felt that when he bet that quickly that, I don't really know how his timing tells are at this point in the match, but I did feel that he was just c-betting, and he was raising so many limps that he doesn't have to have high cards by any means. And this is the kind of board where if you don't have the nuts, or you don't have a flush drawn and gut shot, you basically don't have many outs against the hand I'm representing. This is something, for now I've kind of coined the term lockdown boards, which is a pretty important concept in PLO, and I'll certainly talk about it more. I might rename it because I don't really like that name all that much, but I couldn't think of anything for now, and I'll just introduce it here. But basically, the concept is, on a board where if you don't have the nuts, you usually are drawing dead or near dead, there are a lot of opportunities for bluffing. That's kind of the equivalent of a dry board in Hold'em. You know, a dry board in Hold'em like King 7 Deuce Rainbow gets a lot of folds. You know, there are a lot of check raises and three bets going on the flop with air, just because it's so hard to have hit a hand. And while those boards are somewhat hard to hit in PLO, boards like this are actually tougher to hit, because if you have a hand like, if he has a hand like Ace 10 and I raise, you know, if he has Ace 10, 9, 7, he has 4 outs against the hand I'm representing. If he has, I mean, there are just so many hands where he just doesn't have outs against the hand I'm representing. So many hands like Jack 9, 8, 7 has no outs against the hand I'm representing. So those kind of boards are really good boards to bluff on, and because of that, they're also good boards to kind of call down on or value bet thinly on if your opponent knows that you're playing those boards aggressively. Anyways, I will definitely talk more about that, as I think it's a very important PLO concept, but the moral of the story is that this is a good board to make a move on. He just is very likely to give me credit, and even if he isn't positive, there's not many hands that he can do much with. If he has Ace Jack 5, 6, he has top pair and a gutter. I mean, he has to fold. I prefer the board be a rainbow, so that there weren't flush draws involved. But anyways, he goes ahead and calls. The turn is 8 of clubs. It's kind of not good, because by raising the flop, I'm trying to represent Queen Jack. When the turn hits, I was thinking that, again, he has a lot of hands. I think he has a lot of Ace 10 type hands. Maybe like a King Queen 10 X, Ace Jack 10 X. Occasionally has the nut straight, but not that often. Anyways, I felt like he wasn't necessarily all that strong here. And although this isn't the best card for me to represent, I think that, again, I can kind of lay myself a good price on a bluff. This is definitely an iffy play, but especially since I won like a larger pot earlier, I don't think he would suspect me of making a move here. And when the flush hits, it's another one of those situations where it's a lockdown board, and if he doesn't have a flush, he doesn't have outs against the hand I'm representing. So he can't really talk himself into a call in that way. I kind of wish I bet a little bit smaller here. I don't think I need to bet that large, but I think it's fine to bet that large, because I think he would think I'd bet that size with a flush, a strong flush. Most people think that PLO is a game just about, some people think it's a game all about bluffing, and some people think it's a game just about playing the nuts and letting people chase their weak draws and call down with their weak-made hands, when it's really a combination on both, and it's very board and situation dependent. And learning all the different spots where, it's more of a good time to bluff and where it's more of a good time to basically just play it nitty straightforward, kind of comes with practice, and hopefully I'll be able to teach you a little bit of it. But basically, there are certain boards in PLO that you should rarely be c-betting or two-barreling on, and then there are other boards that are great for it. And, you know, it usually has a lot to do with how many hand combinations can continue against your bet, and also how credibly you can represent a hand. So he eventually folds. I think he might have even had a straight there. Well, yeah, I think he might have. I think he didn't want to get involved in a big pot this early. But I mean, based on his timing, I think I made him lay down a big hand. Ace Jack Jack 10 is very strong with an ace-high suit. Having an ace-high suit's huge. More so in six-handed PLO, just because it's more often you get nuts for second nuts kind of situations. In heads-up PLO, it's not as regular. This is actually another somewhat locked-down board, like we were talking about. It's if one of us has 5-7, the other doesn't have a whole lot of outs. But I decided to go ahead and fold. I don't have really any outs if called. Not even a backdoor draw, really. So, you know, you can't win every pot. 10-8-7-5 with a suit is a pretty good hand. I certainly would have defended that hand, given how often he's been raising buttons, especially. King Queen 10 Deuce is iffy. I would have called a raise, but I wouldn't. I'm glad he folded. Alright, so I raise with King 9-8-6. And this is an interesting flop. It actually hits a whole lot of hands. And for that reason, I decided to bet half pot. And I want to talk about this a little bit because I didn't just mindlessly bet half pot here. There are a lot of hands that hit this board very hard. Or not very hard, but moderately hard. There's a flush draw, there are a lot of straight combinations, and there are high cards out there, and when people defend their big blind, they have high cards a good amount of the time. That said, it's also a board where there are a lot of hands like Jack 10-5-4 double suited without clubs, or, you know, 9-8-7-5, things like that just can't play at all. They have no outs basically against any legit hand. So I think that a bet of 120 on this board accomplishes the same thing as a bet of 200 for the most part. And I think that I give myself a good price here on a C-bet just because of all the times that he just missed the board. And if he did hit the board, it doesn't matter what I bet, he's not going to fold. I absolutely, especially on boards like this, will be betting this size with my very strong hands. But I think that in this spot, it's just a good price on a bluff. And I mostly bet with my strong hands. In a vacuum, it's not better to bet small with your strong hands. I'd rather bet them big. But I bet them small to balance my range because I know kind of what my opponents think about my game. So anyways, that's why I decided to C-bet a little bit smaller. And he folded, which was good. I did also have the king of clubs, so I had a club turned. I could consider three-barreling. I probably would have. Here I flop a pretty strong draw. Ace-king 4-3 is not a great hand. Ace-high suit, though, is pretty good, and he's been raising a lot of buttons, so I think it's a pretty good call. This is a spot with stack sizes where I don't really want to check raise. If I check and he bets about 200, I can, I don't know, raise to 640. And it puts me in a really awkward spot on a lot of turns. I would rather lead here, give him the opportunity to float me with a bad hand or to bluff raise. And if I bet like whatever I bet 160 here and he raises, I'm pretty happy to shove and get the money, and I'm not really far behind anything. So I bet 180. You know, I don't want to get the money in here necessarily, but there are a lot of worse draws that can get the money in with me, and if he does have a set, I'm not even in that bad shape. If he has any kind of straight draw, flush draw combination, I have the nut flush draw, so I'll be in pretty good shape against that. I decided to limp a pretty weak hand here. I certainly expect to be making money if he's not going to be raising the big blind that much, which I think I've kind of calmed him down a little bit. And I just go ahead and C-bet small. It seems to me, especially with how fast he folded, he's not really in the mood to fight for the small pots, which is really something to take note of. This is pretty similar to the hand I just called with out of the big blind, but this time I folded. I think they're both pretty borderline. This is a little worse. The ace-3-4 combination, the last one, helps occasionally. So here we flop a double gutter. We get a 6 or a 10, and we also have a backdoor flush draw. This is one of those boards that I was talking about, so I think a c-bet is a good option, just because he's not going to be... He's going to have to fold a lot, and he's not going to be check-raising a ton. If he makes a small check-raise, I actually feel okay floating it. I have the backdoor flush draw, I have the double gut shot, and I can represent clubs. I can also... I just represent a strong hand when I call check-raise, so he could check-raise and give up, if he knows that that's the kind of board that he can be bluffing on. This is the kind of hand against somebody who's opening a lot of buttons that I like to 3-bet, but given that I'm trying to keep variance low, and it's a marginal 3-bet, to be honest, but given that I'm trying to keep variance low, I'd certainly just rather call. So here, I thought about leading, but this isn't really a board that you want to lead get in on, just because hands you do that against, basically anything that contains a flush draw has you in pretty bad shape. If he has King XXX with a flush draw, or even Jack XXX with a flush draw, I'm not in that great shape. If he has a set, I'm fine, but if he has a set and a flush draw, I'm in pretty bad shape. If he has, like, Ace, King, Queen with a flush draw, I'm in pretty gross shape, because he has some of my straight blockers, too. So I decided to check call here. I have the backdoor flush draw. Obviously, I have a lot of straight outs. And, you know, it's tough to play out of position, but this is a strong enough hand, obviously. Turns to 6, and I don't think I can really represent a lot by leading. Basically, King Jack maybe would check call to lead, because I don't want to check raise and get into a gross spot, but I'm fine just checking and deciding. And I guess I have a couple options here. I can't fold. I just have too many outs. You know, I could potentially represent hearts. I could call to bluff the river hearts. I could call and have pretty good odds right now on hitting my draw, and also some implied odds, because, you know, depending on which draw I hit, there will be a few other draws that missed, and he might be willing to pay me off with a strong made hand. There's also the possibility that I hit and then decide to check and catch a bluff, but I guess I'll kind of decide that as the situation arises. I was also thinking about shoving. You know, I have okay equity when called. And I actually think this is a pretty close decision. I think against a lot of players, a shove here is good, because some people 2-barrel far too much. A lot of people here would be 2-barreling with like a King 6 XX and then would have to fold to the raise because they want to protect their hand. And that's not a bad play against somebody who doesn't check raise hands like this. But you have to check raise. If you notice somebody doing that, you have to check raise a bit lighter. So we hit the nuts. It's a pretty good, it's pretty much the best card to hit. Because, first of all, first of all, it's the nuts. Second of all, the flush missed. Third of all, there are some straight draws that miss. I could have had Jack 10-9, especially, or like 10-9-7, especially with the turn 6. So I think this is a good spot to lead, represent the missed flush draw, lower missed straight draw, things like that. And if he did have a made hand, he might pay me off. This isn't a spot where you expect to be bluff raised very much, because by betting you're really representing the nuts. So if he has any kind of hand, he could just call you if he thinks you're bluffing. And if he wants to bluff raise, if he thinks you're not bluffing, then he thinks you have the nuts, and you shouldn't expect to bluff raise you off the nuts. I think he tanks here for a good bit. In hindsight, I still think that the turn check raise is a very viable option, especially just to counter the way that people aggressively bet turns in position. It's something I do like to add to my game. Had I been able to check shove for pot, I certainly would have done it, or a little more than pot. But I think the stacks were a little bit too big for me to be comfortable getting it in there, and I didn't feel like he was light based on how much he's been giving up on the small pots, things like that. I felt like he had a hand. And I go back to check, and he did have bottom set on the flop. So that worked out perfectly. He certainly wasn't folding at any point. Alright, so 3, 4, 4, 5 double suited. He min raises. I take this as weakness, just being it's the first time he's min raised, as far as I know. It's a weird board. We don't have that much money left. I considered leading very quickly, and eventually decided not to. And I do have a lot of outs on this turn. I think that it's just best to bet. If he raises, I'm in a pretty gross spot. I don't expect him to have 2 pair ever, but he can certainly have a 9. When the 8 hits, I think that I can represent a hand pretty well. I can represent 9x. I would still bet here, somewhat small. I would also have, hands like Jack 10 or like 4, 5, 6 that would play it this way. Diamonds did miss, and he might expect me to randomly bluff or to have a hand like 10-8 and then turn into a bluff, which I probably would just check down and hope the 8's good. But yeah, I decided to go ahead and take a stab at it, laying myself again a good price on my bluff. And he did end up calling. He had a weak 9. And I wasn't really hoping to take him off a hand like that. I was hoping to take him off maybe like a pair and a draw. 8-8-9-9 is a very good hand. I prefer to be a little deeper for this hand. But I decided to limp because, for the same reason I've been limping the whole match, basically. Flop middle set, which is perfect. It's the flop I'm looking for. Second nuts. And I bet, obviously. This is a good board, at least a good flop. It's not a great turn. The flop's very good. So there's just a whole bunch of gut shots on board. So, and 3-card gut shots. Like if he has a 5, 6, 7, 9, 10 jack. There's just a lot of hands that can continue. Like even like a 8, 5, 6 would probably peel 1 there. Turns a jack. It's not a good card at all. I do have 2 9s as blockers, which is more important than some people realize. Just hand combinations wise takes a lot of 9s out of his range. So I think it's a bit less likely he does have the straight. So I'm planning on betting the turn and getting it in, but he leads into me. First, let me talk about betting the turn and getting it in. I bet the turn and get it in because I think that he could be check-raising bluffs occasionally, just like a 8-5-6 that doesn't think I have it. I also think he could check-raise hands like Queen-Jack with any kind of clubs, or King-10, King-Queen 10, things like that. And also, even if he does happen to have the straight, I do have, 10 outs to boat up on him. So I'm pretty comfortable bet getting it in if he checked here. Since he bet, it's a pretty weird spot. There's not really value in raising. I'm not going to get it in with a worse hand by raising. I expect to be good a whole lot, so you might say I could raise for protection value. But if I raise, I'm obviously calling if I raise, but if I raise, I just don't think any worse hand's going to stick it in. The 10 of clubs I actually viewed as a very good card for me. Or not a very good card, but it gave me a straight, and I also felt that he would bluff this a bit too much if he had like a 7-6-5 or even just an 8-5-6. So he goes ahead after a little while, and I think, yeah, he bets. And so I'm thinking, he's basically representing the backdoor flush. I don't expect him to value bet an ace-king this big, so he's representing the flush, which he certainly can have, but I think he has airy hands enough, even just like a Jack 10, maybe not Jack 10 because he had a 10, but what am I trying to say? I guess just gutters that missed, or like even like a low 2 pair turned into a bluff on a board like this that I think I can call. I felt pretty good about it, but he did have kings with a flush draw. That's an interesting line by him. I don't hate it at all, but I just didn't think he would play like that. He caught me off guard. So well played, Peter. He min-raises and I call with junky double-suited hand, and I decided to go ahead and bet again because I think that it's better than my other options, and he just folds. I'm looking back at this hand. I was kind of second-guessing myself right there, but I still feel pretty good about the call. I have a pretty similar hand to last time. I considered re-raising there just because of how weak I feel he is when he open min-raises. But this is just not a very good hand. I didn't want to get in a big pot. I did still want to keep variance down. When you have like a big stack difference like this, you have that urge to just put them away, but you have to kind of fight that and try to stay patient and keep pots small if you think you have the edge. So when he checks behind, I'm obviously betting this turn. I have a lot of equity, and it's better than my other options, as I keep saying. River the second nuts is one of the best cards I could have hit. I don't think he has a nut flush almost ever. I think any nut flush with any pair just bets the flop to get it in. Most nut flushes bet the flop. So I expect to be good here, but I don't expect him to bluff very much if I check, or to value bet super thinly, so I decided to just go ahead and bet. And I decided to bet pretty large because of all the draws that missed on this board. I kind of wanted to turn his whole range into a bluff catcher. So if he does happen to have a hand like Jack-10, that's really the same thing here as 5-6 spades, or a set of threes, which he probably would raise the turn with. But point being, I felt like he had weak hands a whole bunch, and I wanted him to be able to call with. Hey guys, this is Phil. Sorry if that was a little bit jarring, but I actually lost the audio for this portion of the video. On this new headset that I've been using, there's a large button attached to the cord that is apparently a mute button. It's really unnecessarily big, and my hip pressed it against the chair, and so I was muted for about 5-10 minutes, and then I realized I was muted and unmuted myself, so I'm just going to redo the audio from this point on until Past Phil kicks in, and then I'll just bow out gracefully and let him take over. But what I was talking about in this hand was that when you have a very strong hand and you expect your opponent has a very weak hand, you kind of want to polarize your range by betting large. I want to tell him I have a very strong hand or I have air, because what that does is makes his hands like Ace-Jack 5-5 and 10-9 3-4 become the same value as a hand like set of kings or a low flush. Since I think it's so much more likely that he does have a weak hand, I think that I want to kind of raise those hands in relative hand strength in his mind. So I think a larger bet here is more profitable. Also, obviously, compared to a bet of 200, which might fold a hand like 3-4, where 3-4 might find a hero call against this hand, this bet size. I also just make more when called, because twice as big a bet. So I'll just resume the action, and he does call. But looking at the hand, unfortunately, he had the third nuts to my second nuts, so I didn't exactly own him with my river bet sizing. I could have made more potentially by check raising, but I actually think that my play was certainly the best play in a vacuum. I'm taking notes that he checked back a hand that strong because it's very unusual. I didn't think he would do that. And in general, I just like to take notes when somebody does something that surprises me. Usually I can kind of keep track of the way people play without taking notes, but when they do something new, or something I didn't think they were capable of, I have to change my perception of them. The other thing just about making larger bet sizes there is that in kind of in a vacuum, that's the best play against his range, but you have to consider that if somebody realizes you're always betting large there with strong hands and betting weak with your bluffs and marginal hands, then you obviously have to mix it up. So I decided to check back the flop, which is fine. I think that it's a lower variance play, which I've been trying to do this match. Make low variance plays this match. But the turn and river came off pretty poorly for me, and I can't really call a bet at this point. I think betting that flop's totally fine. It's just kind of gross when I get check raised, because I definitely can't play the hand, but I have top pair. And even when I get check called, I don't have a ton of equity. So it's kind of a protection bet only. So I thought about raising this hand just because I interpret his limp as very, very weak, but I keep having to tell myself that I'm trying to keep the variance very low in this match and in all the matches in this tournament. So I check call the flop with my top pair. I think leading is an option, but the problem with leading is that I'll pause it real quick. The problem with leading is that I find myself in a lot of ugly spots on a lot of turns, because he's in position, he gets to see. He's in position, and I have a reverse implied odds hand, where he gets to see how I react on a lot of turns, and what he's going to find is that I don't like a lot of the turns. And so he's going to be able to value bet thinly against me. He's also going to be able to bluff me a lot. And so I decided just to check call. I don't want to build a big pot if I don't have to. Also, by check calling and then checking the turn, I'm not really telling him much about my hand, because that's something I would do with a lot of strong hands. If I had the ace high spades, I would definitely check the turn once I check called the flop. But if I had that hand and I bet the flop, I would rarely check raise the turn with it, though I would some. I don't think he'd expect me to. So the point is, he gets less information when I check call the flop and check the turn than when I lead the flop and then check the turn. Turns a jack of spades, which is a terrible card. It goes check check, and the river is a 9 of hearts. This is an interesting spot just because, I check called the flop because I thought I had the best hand most of the time. But the problem is now, given the way the boards run off, there are just so many hands that have improved to beat me. If you take my hand and throw it against a random hand, I'm sure I'm behind. I would bet that I'm behind on this board. So, I could still check and hope to check it down and be good, but I think this presents a very good opportunity for me to bluff, because basically nothing missed. If I check called the flop, I either have a made hand, which isn't going to be bluffing, it's going to be value betting. B, a draw. Actually, let's divide that into B, a flush draw, which now has a flush. Or C, some kind of straight draw. And if I had a straight draw, or like a pair plus straight draw, so like ace, king, jack, ace, king, queen, things like that. Maybe even as weak as king, jack, 10 with hearts or something. But all of those hands are now 2-pair or better, with the exception of the hand I have, which he can't really know. The only hand I might be bluffing with here or that I should be bluffing with in his mind, is a 3-4-5. That's really it. Maybe like 2, 3, 4 with hearts that I made a really loose peel on, but I think that's actually not really in my range. So, given that this is towards the bottom of my range, that so many of my range are made hands, I think that he really just can't call a bet here. I actually would have preferred betting maybe 150. It's not that much more expensive, and I think ensures that he folds like a 2-pair or a backdoored like lower straight with 7-8. But anyways, he folds, and he folded quickly, so I probably did have the best hand, but I still think that it's a good bluff in that spot. I think it's important in spots where you are pretty much guaranteed to have a good hand, that you take some of your weakest hands and turn them into bluffs if it's likely that they're beat and your opponent's a good hand raider. Likely not meaning more likely than not, but likely meaning very possible. So here he leads into me. It's a really gross spot because I have basically bottom 2-pair, no redraw. I can't fold bottom 2-pair, but I'm certainly can't raise as deep as we are. Not that we're that deep, but I just can't raise and get it in. And I don't really want to raise fold, so I think the best option is to call and then hope to check it down. And I don't think that he's taking this line as a bluff very often. I think that a lot of his hands that he'd want to continue bluffing with, he would just bluff the turn. And the line of bet, check, bet, especially leading, and then checking and then betting, just seems so much like a 2-pair type hand, like 10-6 or 10-9. 10-6 might be a little thin on the river, but probably not. So 10-6, 10-9, maybe he was getting tricky with like 7-8, or maybe like a Jack 8-7 with spades, a super monster that he wanted to check raise and get me to kind of, bet call with like a 2-pair, an open-ender hand that was like really dead to his hand, or weaker spades and an open-ender, something like that. So this is a good hand, but it's a pretty ugly hand to 3-bet. You get in really gross spots when you 3-bet a hand, like ace, jack, jack, 6. So I just call them in raise, and on this flop there's nothing to do but check fold. I don't know why I even consider raising. I don't think that's a hand you can raise. King, jack, 5-3 double suited. It looks a little prettier than it is, although that flop is exactly as pretty as it looks. 2 backdoor flush draws to go with the nut straight. So it's a great flop, and you have to bet. I have to bet small here. and I should bet small here just because that's what I'm doing. That's what I've been doing with all my C bets on dry boards like this, lockdown boards that not many hands have outs. If yeah. Oh, sorry. I guess pass feels about to kick in, but I'm just saying, not many hands have outs. So he's basically check folding or check calling this flop, regardless of my bet size. So if I'm going to be c-betting small and getting a good price on my c-bets, I'm going to have to bet small with my strong hands. Anyways, I guess I'll let pass fill take over. See you soon. Ooh. So basically, I just think... Sorry, I just hit something and the sound might not have been working. Anyways, this is the type of board where you either hit the board or you didn't hit the board. So betting 150 just accomplishes as much as betting 250. So when I'm c-betting with air, this is the size I make, and because of that, this is the size I make when I have a very strong hand. But he goes ahead and folds. Limp, somewhat trashy hand here. I flop a king-high flush draw, nothing else. Backdoor straight draw, and he pots into me. I think the best play here is just to call. I fear a re-raise if I raise, and I can't really stand that heat. So I'd rather just call, see a turn, decide what to do from there. And I immediately hit my flush, and he checks pretty quickly, which makes me think that he doesn't have a very strong hand. Like, he has a hand that he knows can only beat a bluff, and he can't really value bet. I think he probably has a straight here, or two-pair type, or set type hand. Maybe even a low flush, but I'm going for two streets of value here. But unfortunately, he folds a turn. Queen 9-4-3 is not even good enough to defend to a min raise, unfortunately. This is a pretty junky hand too. This is more of a steal than anything. I'm not, terribly unhappy if he calls being in position and it being PLO, but I think that I've been fairly quiet, especially limping all the buttons I have, that I have a few free steals coming up. This is obviously a terrible hand. A decent hand here. Decent double-suited hand. Double-suited is always nice. There are three kind of connecting cards. The flush draws are fairly high. And the flop is Jack 6-6. I have a backdoor flush draw, and there are two clubs. This is a weird spot. And I think I decided to bet half pot here for the same reason that I keep talking about. You either hit it or you don't. There's not many hands. If I were to bet like 250 here, I'm not really representing a wide range of credible hands, basically just boats, trips, and like strong flush draws plus pairs, like aces with clubs. So I think that by doing this, I represent a wider range of hands, I get a better price on my bluff, and I basically say, hey, if you want to try and take the pot, go ahead, but you're not going to make as much out of it, and I didn't have to risk as much to see you do it. And that's not to say if he does make a move that I'm going to fold. He does go ahead and raise somewhat quickly. I think that's a half pot raise. And I have a decision here. I don't beat anything but a bluff. And I'm not really looking at my hand as, I'm not like looking to get it in thinking I have a jack, queen jack. I'm looking, can I reshove here, semi-bluff, or float and take it away later, or check it down and be good. And I think that the best option here, given I just kind of had some reads on his timing and sizing, I guess you could say. I felt like he took a little while to check the flop into me, and I felt like after taking that time, he wouldn't check with a strong hand. I felt like he would take that time and then lead, or lead quickly, or check quickly if he had a strong hand. But taking that time and then checking to raise seemed a little weak to me. It seemed like he was thinking, ooh, I want to make a move. I don't know if I can. Maybe not. Okay, I'll check. And then thinking, oh, I changed my mind. So I go into the tank here. I don't think it's bad to give off any kind of timing tells as far as, thinking a lot here. First of all, I will do it with strong hands for balance, and also just because he's not doing this with the hand like pocket kings to raise call or raise decide. So I basically have the best hand, or he's got me beat. I do have, if he does have 6x, I have 2 jacks to hit. I also have a backdoor flush draw, which is basically 1 out. Backdoor straight draw potential. And he goes ahead and folds. I can't say goes ahead today. 10-8-7-3, double suited. Not a great hand. There's some connectivity, double suited, and I just felt he'd been limping so much, he'd been min-raising so much that his limping range must be terribly weak. I flop a bottom pair and 2 backdoor flush draws. Stack sizes are pretty weird. And I decide to go ahead. I was thinking about betting, but I didn't really know what to do if you shove, because I'm almost committed against most hands. So I thought this might be a board he would stab at, and I decided to go for a check shove. But he checked behind, and I turned a flush draw, but it's still not really a great card. I decided to check, and I wasn't sure if I was going to check call or check raise. Probably not check fold, but possibly. Probably not. Now that I hit my 10, I think there's nothing to do except check and hopefully win the pot, and I do. And I went back to see what he had and took the note that he didn't take a stab at that board, because I kind of expect a lot of people to take stabs at boards like that when you check to them. Especially when it puts me in the position of check shoving or check folding. I think people just like to take stabs there. I decided to make a loose re-raise here. There are a couple reasons for it. One, he's been min-raising a lot, and I think he has weak hands when he min-raises overall. 2, stack sizes are such that it's going to be a good size for me to shove the flop, and he's going to make a lot of incorrect folds. I'm not shoving 100% of flops, but I'm shoving a lot of flops, and there's going to be 720 in the pot, and just a little more than that in a stack, I believe. So I think that it just puts him in a lot of spots where he makes incorrect folds, especially because I haven't 3-bet. I don't know if I've 3-bet the whole match, so he has to put me on a very strong hand. This is not also total junk. It plays fairly well against a lot of different hands. So for all those reasons, I raise. I don't think I'm getting him to fold a ton now, but I think he folds a lot of flops. He repots me, basically putting himself all in, and it's just, I need 33% equity to call. I think I have about, 43% against his range, maybe better. So it's a no-brainer call. I mean, we're leaving 100, the money's getting in. I kind of just like to call here and then check call any flop just for fun. But I flop the nuts, so it's even more fun. And I'm just hoping he has no outs, which he does have no outs. This is a pretty thin re-raise by him. Not terrible, but given that I hadn't re-raised the whole time, this plays really badly against a lot of different hands. Though if I don't have aces, it's not in terrible shape. And I won. So that was the first round match. Unfortunately, my second round match against Stinger, which was a really good match, my internet disconnected during it, and I had to restart my computer and restart my modem and things like that. So I lost the video for it, and also unfortunately I did lose that match. So there are no other videos from this tournament that you'll be seeing, but hopefully we'll get some other high stakes PLO action and also a bunch of mid-stakes PLO action where we can kind of talk more about the fundamentals and things that you should be thinking about. So thanks for watching. This has been Phil Galfond for BlueFirePoker.com.